Good afternoon. My name is Bob Norman, and on behalf of the York County Historical Committee, I'd like to welcome you to this afternoon's presentation. And it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Ms. Amy Waters Yarsinske, who will be presenting an exciting lecture for us today. She's the author of several best-selling, award-winning nonfiction books, notably An American in the Basement, The Betrayal of Captain Scott Spiker and the Cover-Up of His Death, which won the Next Generation Indie Book Award for General Nonfiction in 2014. Amy has published over 85, now she tells me it's 87 now, nonfiction books, most of them on current affairs, the military, history, and the environment. Amy graduated from Randolph-Macon Women's College in Lynchburg, Virginia, where she earned her Bachelor of Arts in English and Economics, and the University of Virginia School of Architecture, where she earned her Master of Planning. She also holds numerous graduate certificates, including those earned from the Civic Leadership Institute and the Armed Forces Staff College in Norfolk. Amy is the former president of the Norfolk Historical Society and is active in many professional and civic organizations. In addition to her publications, she has regularly appeared as a guest and commentator for major media outlets. Now that we know a little bit about her, let me turn it over to Amy Yarsinske.
Thanks, Bob. Well, thanks to all of you for having me back, sort of. I was supposed to be here 2 years ago when we had a little problem. But all is well, and so I'm so happy that Bob persisted and was able to get me here today. The subject is going to be the same as it would have been then. The book is, as some of you have out here, is Flyboys. Talks about Glenn Curtis's Southern experiment over in Newport News in the municipal small boat harbor area. And for those of you familiar with that spot, there's also an historic marker over there to that effect. Very hard to get to, but it is there. This was an interesting project for me because it came to me at a time when I had been working on several other aviation projects, actually. And a friend of mine, as I was telling the story before this got started today, a gentleman that I had known for quite some time who was a small private pilot, small aircraft pilot, he liked to go garage sailing, estate sales, and he was over by in the Ocean View section of Norfolk. And he was looking at, he was just fully intending to just kind of go down the driveway and see what was what. Well, for anyone who knows about the former Naval Air Station Norfolk and the Naval Air Depot, which was there as well until 1995, many of the people who worked there were generational in their employment. And these facilities went back to 1917, 1918, 1922. And so some very famous photographers had taken some photographs, and one of them happened to be Frank J. Conway, who was the Curtiss Airplane Company out of Hampton, New York's primary company photographer at the time. Well, you have to imagine my friend's surprise. He goes to this garage sale, and at the end of the driveway is a box, and it had been put out for trash. Inside the box are about 500 photographs, all canvas back, very old, incredible photographs of airplanes and pilots. And it happens to be that those were started with photograph number 1, 2, 3, 4, 10, up to sequences from the Curtiss Aeronautical Station in Newport News, and also the military pilots he trained from around the world, and including the very first Navy pilots that trained and then transferred over to the detachment and the old Jamestown Exposition Grounds at Norfolk. And so he brought those to me. They were going to throw them out. So he said, well, I didn't want to take them, Miss Amy, without giving them something for it, so I gave him $1. And then he brought him promptly to my house because I didn't live that far from where he was. He called me and said, I've got something. He was so excited. He said, I've got something. You've got to have these right now. These are for you. I got them for you. I said, George, do you want your dollar back? Turns out I have an equal collection to, there's another guy in Virginia that has an equal size collection of these photographs. They're worth thousands of dollars, obviously, and everybody knows that. They're extremely rare. There aren't copies of them. Frank Conway was an amazing photographer. Wouldn't have been in his job if he hadn't been. And he documented so many different aspects of every facet of what was going on in this school. So this core collection of images sort of formed the beginnings of, in my head, of this story that needed to be told, this Flyboys story. Glenn Curtis, depending on how familiar you are with the nascent aviation industry, as it wasn't even an industry at the time, was looking for warmer grounds to test his airplanes. Hammondsport, New York, Buffalo, New York, those places were freezing over on him. He couldn't get a lot done during the year. And he was thinking warmer water if he came here. He was looking for a little bit of a surprise there with that. So he at first tried to entice the city of Norfolk to let him move part of his operation to the city. They didn't want it. But as I said earlier, talking before I got started, Norfolk made a couple other mistakes this way too. They also declined the Naval Academy, which would have been in the Berkeley section of Norfolk if they'd let it go. So imagine this was just another lack of judgment when it came to an opportunity that came up. So Curtis, he tried and tried, didn't work. Norfolk was not going to be swayed in any way, shape, or form with this. So Curtis he thought, well, I've got some contacts with Newport News. At the time, those contacts were people who were shipping oysters and seafood up north, and the cannery business. It was a very lucrative business from the Newport News side up to the north. So he got a friend in Connecticut to start wheeling and dealing in Newport News and trying to get him some introductions. Well, Newport News turned him down the first time in 1910 as well. They weren't sure. They just weren't sure what he was talking about trying to do. No one down here really saw a lot of airplanes. Airplanes were rare. We think today, it's nothing of this. When we see an airplane, it's an airplane. But then it would have been a rare occurrence to see one. So he starts trying to do this negotiation back and forth. It took him several visits here. There are several photographs that were in these pictures that were found on the curb of Curtis leaving the original some of the original hotels in Hampton and Newport News. And I think that's fairly interesting to see also in vehicles, things like that, that you don't normally see of Curtis outside of his environs in New York at that time. Now, the other interesting thing about him, too, was that one of my favorite photographs out of the book, and if you have a copy with you today, is the last piece in the book. You see a picture of Glenn Curtis standing with his Jenny aircraft flying past his head on the field. That was in those photos as well. And when I saw those, I knew who everybody was in the photos. I had pictures of Billy Mitchell, Vernon Castle, all these famous pilots at the time frame. By 1915, Curtis had gotten a little bit able to convince officials that if you lease this land to me for $1 a year, I'll make good use of it. I'll build my hangars, I'll build my production facilities, I'll build my whatever, ramps for his seaplanes, that kind of thing. So he's successful around 1915, so he needed somebody to run this place. Well, he couldn't do it. He's busy with his overall operations out of Hammondsport. So he gets Captain Thomas Baldwin, an aeronaut, famous figure at the time. Imposing figure. He's also very tall and very good manager, as he was able to travel with Curtis down here, do some negotiation, and get the leases set up. And it was going to be a fairly straightforward process of then having to employ. So he thought, okay, where am I going to get my instructors from to teach people how to fly? Their demand was already starting. World War I had already started in Europe, And he thought, well, okay, this is got to be easy because, you know, this is it's south of the Mason-Dixon, but it can't be that hard, can it? And then it turned to be a really hard thing to do. He had to draw his pilots out of Hammondsport and from Buffalo and San Diego, and he got Walter Lees, he got Costa, he got a bunch of them out of different, he got Karlstrom. He got them all out of different places because he found out there were several problems with having anything below the Mason-Dixon. There were no skilled aviation workers here, none. No one knew how to do manufacturing, none of that. He didn't have the people to put together a syllabus for flight training for at that time it was mostly the militaries of other countries. The British were sending people here to learn how to fly. Canadians, they closed the school in Toronto, so he needed to get those pilots down here to learn how to fly. He had United Nations of pilots coming in. He had Russians, he had Japanese. Of note, he had, remarkably, because if you think about the time frame of this is 1915 to 1922, 1915, the World War I years, he ended up with several Japanese here to learn not only how to fly, but to observe his training syllabus and how he was working all this, who turned out to be the architects of Pearl Harbor. And they would have been, by the time Japan was ready to declare war, they would have been your senior operators in their military at the time. I point this out in the book because, to me, history is always a building process, and you see the building blocks of that history in motion, and what you may think is an interesting or a quirky chapter of Curtis's history is actually a very important one that occurs right here. With all these pilots coming in, we weren't in the war yet. It was getting close, and we had some pilots who kind of wanted to go over and fly with the French and the British and that sort of thing. So we were training some Americans here too, quite a few of them. He had to cut off his private pilot lessons, actually, because of this. Victor Karlstrom had to stop training Nada Snook, who ended up training Amelia Earhart how to fly. She was here. He first hired her as a mechanic, working on planes in trade for her lessons. So she was a tour de force over here. He had to kind of stop some of the experimentation for Wanamaker and for Ruth Law. He built a triplane for Ruth Law right here in Newport News. And she came here to fly that after Victor Karlstrom tested it for her. She was not allowed to test her own aircraft. That would not have been within the parameters of acceptable things at the time, even though she was this amazing pilot. So after Victor Karlstrom actually got to fly the plane first, he was the country's premier test pilot at the time. If you're thinking about famous test pilots in our history, he was the top-notch pilot at the time. Set a lot of records. He was your go-to. All the aircraft companies wanted him, but he worked for Curtis. So interestingly, she does get here. She does get her plane, and then she flies it around, does a couple of demos with it in different places. Tries to do a cross country with it. A lot of interesting things started here that way. But then the war came to the point where Nada Snook lost her flight lessons due to the war. That ended 3 lessons shy of getting her pilot's license. So she had to go finish that out in California. But then, with the war starting up, we started training here in Newport News. Curtis did. Navy and the Army, at the time, Signal Corps pilots who were coming through. The Army had not yet settled on what became Langley Field. They were still trying to negotiate the land deal with that. That was going on. I talk about that in the book as well. That was not an easy. That negotiation was not easy there. There were a couple of farmer land holdouts there, but they ended up with Navy pilots that would end up where the Jamestown Expedition grounds are in the Naval Detachment at Sewell's Point. But he trained all these early pilots. So all these photographs are in this box. So it goes back to the box. And the box fascinated me for weeks and weeks. I would sit there and look through this box, and you could lay them sequentially, and it told you the story, because I actually have photograph number 1 on the day it opened. He did a soft opening October 29th, 1915. By November, a couple of weeks later, he was inviting more dignitaries, people in to see what was going on and what he was doing. He was still building hangars. The Scott of hammers was probably driving people who lived around it nuts. He was building all kinds of hangars and assembly buildings, and he had his ramps all done. He had introduced his military flying boats. He had Jennies. He would take an airplane and he would experiment with it. He'd build a whole new airplane within a hangar and cover it. You couldn't see it. He had these canvas drops, and he would drop them down, and he would bring an airplane out, and there are some photographs, and amongst these photographs of an airplane that would be in existence maybe 1, maybe 2 days tops, and he'd totally change it. It was like starting off the drawing board all over again. So that's how rare some of these photographs are. But he was doing that kind of assemblage there, and most people didn't know that at the time. And he kept that pretty quiet because, again, this is a nascent industry. There's a lot of stealing of ideas going on back and forth. In fact, if anyone's familiar with Curtis, he was always in a lawsuit with somebody. The Wright brothers, Douglas, any number of people. They would argue over trademarks and patents and other things that they had going on, and the irony of it is, eventually by World War II, Curtis and Wright are in business together. The companies had merged. It's just that kind of thing. But in Curtis's lifetime, it was always a battle, and everything was a state secret. But as he went through in his process, I always make notes for myself, by the way, and I never follow them, so. I have a lot in common with the president, I guess, right now. I don't read my own. I don't read my own things as I go along. But anyhow, as he goes along with World War I starting, he started to have his pilots peeled off. The military was coming to his instructor pilots and saying they wanted Victor Carlson to put a uniform on and go teach in their actual military schools. What was happening at that time, the evolution was occurring to the point where the Navy was developing Pensacola. They had fields in Texas at that point for the Army pilots, and they had even other East Coast bases for the Army pilots to start to learn, and they were starting to employ their own and get their better instructors out of these private schools. So Curtis and Wright and all of the rest of them, they were losing their pilots to the military. Even Baldwin, as old as he was at the time, was made an aircraft inspector for the military. So he was having to go and inspect Liberty engines, and that's what he did for most of the war. Curtis lost interest eventually in what was going on here. Really, by the end of World War I, he was out of it. His interest in it had waned to the point where he could no longer put any more money into it, and it was transitioning in a really interesting way after the war into more of a sort of a private strip for people to come in and just bring in the surplus warplanes, to have a private airplane field there. There really wasn't much going on after that. Of note, of the things that happened there during the war, Victor Carlson did not survive the war. He actually was killed in a training accident at Newport News. The plane went up. He had Carrie Epps on board with him, a student pilot, and the wings on the airplane folded up, and it went in. And that happened a lot in that time frame. Billy Mitchell crashed an airplane, ruined an airplane over there. He came in on his last solo flight. He took a solo flight, crashed on the runway, and fortunately did not get hurt, but he had to be extricated from the plane. It was upside down on the field. I mean, and things like that happened often. It was a very tragic time in aviation. Accidents, the pilot life expectancy wasn't very, very long. If you flew long enough at that point in time, it was not a surprise that Victor Carlson died. Another famous pilot who came through here to learn to fly was Vernon Castle, the famous dancer. He's like the rock star of his time frame. He was pulling in the equivalent of millions of dollars as a famous dancer, doing the Hippodrome and all the famous theaters all across the country, New York to the West Coast. He and his wife Irene were they came up with all these different dances, and they were just the biggest thing, like the Beatles, the time frame. Everybody wanted to see them. Everybody wanted to be a part of their orbit, and when they came here, they would stay at the Chamberlain or another nicer, whatever nice hotel they could find wherever they went. And they had a fancy car. They would drive over to the airfield every day, and he would swagger out of that car, and there are pictures of him with the car, and he would hire a kid to make sure nothing happened to the car while it was sitting on the field, like anything was going to be over in the boat harbor, at the time, but he didn't want anything happening to his car. And so all these pictures popped out at you as you're looking through them. You see, what is this very attractive, beautiful woman doing, lounging in the back of this touring car, And it turned out to be Vernon Castle. Sadly, Vernon was killed in Texas in an Army uniform. He was an instructor pilot. He was a great pilot. He turned out to be a wonderful pilot. And an Army instructor pilot in Texas, when he was killed, he saved his student's life, actually, that day. He didn't think the student was going to do too well. He didn't. So he put the student in the back seat, and he took the front seat in the plane. And when the plane went down, Vernon died, not the student. But that was just the kind of person that he was. And you learn a lot by going through and just dissecting the lives of all the people and all their relationships and how they all work together. I actually knew a pilot who had flown with Admiral Byrd to the Antarctic, and it turns out that he knew Bert Acosta quite well, who is in the photographs, and was an instructor pilot over here in Newport News. And Bert Acosta, who was kind of a bad boy of aviation at the time, got into a lot of trouble, always in a lot of trouble, from pub fights to any number of things that went on. He was always having to be extricated from something. He turned out to be a pretty amazing pilot, and that's why Admiral Byrd picked him for his role in his Antarctic expeditions. But Ted Petrus was a Marine Corps colonel when he retired, but he was one of Byrd's pilots. And at the end of his life, I got to know him, and he actually had a bunch of photos. And so you see the crossover in time of everybody that you're working with when you're doing these projects like this. And so it's never about just the project that I'm working on, like this book on the Curtis Field of Newport News. It's about acknowledging the fact that that's just part of a continuum of other things that were going on at that time frame, and making sure that you explain the context in which they fall under. Because Curtis was using people here. He had hired away Benjamin Douglas Thomas from Sopwith in England. When Curtis wanted to do something, he did. He's kind of like the Elon Musk of aircraft manufacturers at the time, and all those trade secrets and patents and things like that were swirling around. Sopwith owned a lot of those, and they had a lot of people who were great engineers working for them. And he hired them away when he wanted to do a great project, and he knew he needed the best. He just threw a little more money that way and brought him over. And so he was over here too in Newport News, working with the field and developing those aircraft. Some of those aircraft you see for one day and not see another day, they would come and go over there, and that was part of that relied heavily on people like Thomas, who had been with Sopwith, and of course they had their interests too. I mean, they wanted to see everyone fare well with the aircraft they were being supplied for the war eventually. So those test beds they were doing over here in Newport News were very important, even during the war itself. The area that, I don't know how familiar everyone is here with, I would imagine you'd be fairly familiar being in the Yorktown area with Newport News, but I know that when I went over there the first time in that area, a Navy commander went with me. He said, "You're not driving over there by yourself, sweetheart. It's not too far from the shipyard. You're not doing this on your own. I'm like, why not? He said, it's not very safe over that part of town anymore. He said, well, okay, fine. We're going to go over here and we're going to go look. I have to go get a feel for this, the space. I need to see the space. I always have to see the area I'm working on. And, and it really isn't a very big area, and he got landlocked there. That was a very poor choice it was great for flying boats, but it was not great for land-based aircraft. And Curtis in his head thought that what became the Army Air Forces later on, as Army Signal Corps then, developed out of the Army Signal Corps, Army Air Corps, Army Air Forces. And that the Navy would want to co-locate with him in that location. He thought that everything else that was built around would all just fold for all those military services coming around him. He was right in the fact that they would co-locate, but not with him. They went to Norfolk and they went to the Hampton sides of this equation, and it put him out of business basically because they developed their own capabilities, and they did it faster than he thought they would too. I did not get the impression in reading all the things about Curtis over the years that he was brilliant, but some parts of him, I was saying earlier that he was a bit schizophrenic in many ways. He'd gone from everything had to be fast, he did cars, he did motorcycles, he was into the airplanes, and then he really just wanted to do real estate. He dove out of the active parts of his aviation business, anything to do with motorcycles and anything. I mean, he decided to go to the big money in real estate in Florida, and that's what he did. At the end of his life, when he died in 1930, he died actually just ahead of a court case he was going to resolve with, again, the rights. And yet he was not really involved in airplanes anymore. This was a long-held battle, the long-running gun battle basically with them, that was finally going to come to a head in court, and he died of appendicitis before he'd get there. But whenever he picked up his cards and wanted to pull away from the table, he did it, and it was very sudden. I think that when it ended after 7 years in Newport News, it was probably time. It just seemed to be gone, and he closed up shop. And he had already developed Miami as a place where he could actually function in warm water, so he really didn't need Newport News anymore, and it was too small an operation. So he had really diversified. He was in San Diego at that point, and he was in Miami. He was in the warm areas, and they didn't need him to train anybody anymore. But after the war, there's no point to it. So that's how that story kind of ends for him. But I can say that when he was here and he was at his zenith, the public was always, they developed a trolley spur down onto the municipal small boat harbor so that people could ride the trolley right on down they were always packed. On a Sunday afternoon, he'd open up everything for an open house, and it would be packed full of people. And a lot of the photographs that I saw in that box when I opened it up were just hundreds of people coming off trolleys. They had carts set up where they could have concessions and other things, and it was a day trip for families to come down, and they could see an airplane for the first time, most of them. It was an amazing thing for people to see. They get off the ferries on that side of the water. They come over from Norfolk and do the same thing, ride the ferries over and come see. They come down on the steam lines just to see what he had going on there, because it was such a curiosity. It was an amazing curiosity for people. I got to talk to a lot of very interesting, also researchers while I was doing this project, and one of them was the author of a book about Walter Lees, and Walter Lees was one of his, probably, I would say, looking at the profiles of all the people he had as instructor pilots, Walter Lees was probably the best instructor pilot he ever had, and in fact anybody had at the time. Victor Karlstrom was his top test pilot. He also had to teach. He didn't like that, but he did it anyway. And there were some other curious ones there too, other than Vernon and Irene Castle, who were mainstays. I don't know how many of you remember the name Buck Gallup. Buck Gallup, the Army pilot, very flamboyant. His real name was Harold Marcellus Gallup, local kid at the time. He opened his newspaper up, and when he saw that there was going to be some kind of aviation operation that Curtis was going to open up in Newport News, and he basically was like, well, howdy, I'm going to get myself over there and learn how to fly an airplane. And I think everybody just thought he was crazy, because they're like, you're not going to be able to learn to fly an airplane. He turned out to be a very famous Army aviator during the war. A lot of crazy stories about some of the things that happened. There's a silver bullet story and some other things that went on, with Buck Gallup that made the movies and other things later on. He was a very interesting, colorful character. But you also had Eddie Stinson Aircraft. His sister, the Stinsons were famous at that time frame in early aviation. You had Billy Mitchell, you had Vernon Castle, obviously. You had Jimmy Johnson, another famous exhibition aviator, famous pilot with some of the companies, flew all over the country. They trained a good portion of the Lafayette Escadrille over here in Newport News, which is a fascinating story in and of itself. There are a lot of, if you're not researching this particular area, the Lafayette Escadrille, some of the universities that hold the collections on the Lafayette Escadrille are very territorial about that. And so that is a tough story to tell. They all want to hold very tight to their information on that squadron. I don't know what they think is going to help with that, by holding it all back, but you have to find ways to get around it to find the information that you need to have. Fortunately, there are some more open archives that are helping. I've had to buy parts of archives before. We were discussing beforehand, my own personal collection. I have over 250,000 photographs in my own collection. That's 250,000 photographs. There are prints, slides, some digitals, mostly not digitals though, unless I've had to put them to print. You've got real picture postcards, you've got any number of other formats. And it's 30-some years now of collecting that sort of thing wherever I go and however I find them, But if you look at something like the box of photos, there's 500 or so photos in that box. And it's that kind of thing. And then, fortunately, people have left me, other collections, and as I'm moving along through projects, and I'm always working on more than one at a time, I've written a lot of aviation, and so much of what I have in my collection is fascinating. I've done 2 books on Naval Air Station Oceana by itself, and I hold their original copies because some years ago, someone decided it was a good idea to throw out all their original photographs at Oceana, and nobody digitized them. So when they wanted to do the mess over again at Oceana, I had to provide those photos back, and then we had to blow them up so they could use them again. But it's things like that. So when you're looking at a project like this one, it's not just the photos that were in that box that day that I had to pick from. I had to go through and really go through other archives. And one of the things that happened with this project was the Sergeant Memorial Room at the library, the Big Norfolk Library downtown. It's a beautiful library now. They've got I'm hoping it's going to be more fully open again. But back in the time frame when I was doing this, it was fully open and I could go do whatever. They called me one day because they had some aviation photographs. They didn't know what they were. Somebody donated them. And I flipped through them. The minute I flipped through them, I knew what they were. They were the Curtis School over here in the facility over here in Newport News. And they're like, I said, well, are there any problems using these photos for this project? No, none. So we scanned them. We got them scanned, and they turned out to be very, very important photos because some of those planes that were being put out there, test flown, gone the next day, were in these photos because they had belonged to somebody who had been associated with that school going back to that time frame, and the family didn't know what they were, and they just gave them to the library. So it's things like that that you sort of happen into to give you more of that story. Also, I found while I was doing this project, Yorktown is a very, very, as you all know, a wonderful place for its history, and I made notes to myself today to mention the fact that I did a book on Yorktown 4 years ago that my publisher has been holding on to and hasn't printed yet. And it's bigger than the book I did on Williamsburg, and it's bigger than one I did, obviously, on Jamestown. However, included in that project is the aviation field at Yorktown at the old mine depot. Also in some of these photos the library had at the time were that mine depot airfield. And so they are included in a very nice section in that Yorktown book when I have to force the issue of getting printed. I think my publisher was surprised that that book was bigger than Williamsburg. There's a lot of reasons why it's bigger than Williamsburg, because the history here to me for Yorktown turned out to be far more, I don't know, just more fascinating to me than the other ones. Your friends in the other parts of the parts of the tips of the triangle here, and I had more fun doing it because of these various things that the history continued on, and it continued forward with so much interest in the wars of the 20th century, but also all that in between that was going on here, and the preservation that was going on at the same time. So it was really very interesting for me. And so those are included in that, and that is, of course, mostly a post-war World War I story, but an important one because as the discussion went beforehand here, one of the things about that story of the mine depot is when you hear that the first aircraft carrier was in Hampton Roads for its various record-setting moments. You're thinking Hampton Roads in terms of what everybody sees as it opens up into the harbor here, between Norfolk and Hampton. You're thinking that must be where it was, because that's where the aircraft carriers are parked today. That is not where it took place. It took place right here in the York River, because they pulled them up here. They were using the bombers, and they were also looking at the landing procedures. It was a lot calmer in the York than it was out a little bit further in the Hampton Roads, and they parked it right out here in the York River. And those photos were actually in these photos that these people did not know what they were. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I can't believe it. And so that was VT1. The squadron VT1 was one of the ones that this person, whoever had these photos going way back, must have been associated with a couple of these facilities. Not only the Curtis School, probably could have been in the mechanics side of it, whatever it may have been, ended up with that VT1 squadron over here at the mine depot, because you can see the notations on the backs of the photos. And that's the kind of detective work that sort of was fascinating about doing not only the Curtis book, but also the Yorktown book. It's the tie between the two. It was an interesting tie between the two. I don't want to take up all the talking time here. I wanted to be able to have some questions from all of you, so I told Bob I would kind of stop talking and let you ask some questions. And I know there've got to be some out here.
I have two. One is, how were you able to identify what the picture was of or who was in it? And also, this box of photos that your friend got, did he find out from the people how they had acquired the photos?
Yes. The person whose house it was, that part of Ocean View is full of people who used to work at the old aviation depot on the base. They used to fix all the A6s and all. That's the more recent memory people would think about. But the Navy got rid of the depot in 1995, and I was there for all that. They went through this whole process, and I was already talking to people inside the depot. They were already giving me things. One of the interesting days I had there was that they were making them throw things away. So if you work on airplanes at all, going back to 1920s, there was a die cast for every part, for every airplane in these bins going through these long things. It was a dream for any person who was restoring an aircraft. If you were out at the Pungo airfield and you needed to get a part made for an airplane, one of those old airplanes he's got out there, you would have loved to, you would have paid any price for that stuff, and they threw it all out. And interestingly, they had all these photos and all this artwork. They had all the rondelles for the airplanes, all the squadron insignias, the group insignias, anything they had done, even carriers. They had done all this work, and they were told they had to throw it out. And I'd been talking to these guys for weeks and weeks and weeks, and so we got to be friends, and and they knew to call me. So my husband at the time had a Jeep Cherokee that looked handy, and beat my car at the time. And so they said, we need you to come out, because they're going to make us throw this in the dumpster out back. But if I put somebody in the dumpster, we'll hand it back to you and put it in the back of your car. But it has to go in the dumpster technically first. So they put a guy in the dumpster who was handing it, one guy was handing it to the other one, they hand it, and they put it back out again, and then they put it in my car. So I ended up with a ton of stuff, and then I sent a petty officer over there to secure a couple of bigger things for the museum down in Pensacola, because they shouldn't have been thrown away. They should have been, technically a lot of this should have been sent to the museum at Pensacola, because that would have made too much sense, you know, at the time. But tons of photographs, metal boxes with the negatives and everything. What they did with the planes after World War II, you know, they shoved F-4U Corsairs into these, they took the wings, fold them up, put them in these huge containers over on the base where you pass the MAC terminal over at Norfolk now. Back in that woodline area, they had all these big containers, and they put all these airplanes in there after the war they wanted to keep, you know, so they had them sealed up in there. And all these photographs, this whole process of doing this were taken of it, and they were in these long metal boxes, really nice metal boxes. I got all those metal boxes and with all these negatives. So I've used them in different books over the years, showing people what goes on, you know, with this process. And I've shared them with Pensacola. They've, you know, gotten copies of stuff like that. They share with me. It's a back and forth. It's like Amy's archive and their archives, and we do share, because that's the way that should work. You know, I shouldn't have things that I can't share like that, you know, with those folks like that. They need it too. And so the box, going back to the question, the person had worked, was very elderly at the time. This is back in the 90s, and had passed away, had worked at the depot. So no doubt, that's exactly where they came from. They had been probably a box in the middle of a storage room. They needed it for something else, and he didn't want to see them thrown away either, and he took them home, you know, and that's how a lot of that worked. I'd been in a lot of houses over there, seeing people over the years and doing interviews. You should see the things people had at one point in time where they walked away from that kind of thing. Now, the other part of your question was... How'd
you identify what the photo...
That's the fun part. There are, and I didn't mention the books I have in my collection, a lot of the early books on the aircraft and who the pilots are. They're Facebooks for all, like there's a Facebook for all the first naval aviators, all the first Army people. These books are very rare now because it's very hard to get hold of them, but I have them. And you can flip through them and just look right at the faces, and it gives you their whole profile. It tells you where they went to Yale, Harvard, UVA, whatever. It tells you what their lives were like. It tells you what happened to them after the war, where they died in service, they died after the war, died in a car accident, whatever it was. It'll tell you in the book. And then I've got all the early books, like Lockheed, the anglicized version of that is with the CK in the way they spell it. But in the old spelling, it was a GH in the way they spell it. Well, he wrote books on all the early aviation stuff. He wrote books about how he was trying to develop aircraft, shapes of birds' wings and things like that. You know, this is really early stuff. I have all these early books. They go back to, like, I don't know, aeronaut period of time, and I know what all the aircraft were. And if I need to identify an aircraft, if I can get a look at the bureau number on the aircraft or the various squadron rondel on an aircraft or whatever it may be, I can identify the airplane. I'm very good at that. And actually, they use me out of Pensacola to do that because I just do it so readily. For me, it's like second nature, you know. But I have a photographic memory for that kind of thing, so that's why that works, you know.
When you talk about depot, is that the Norfolk, is or was the Norfolk Naval Air Station?
Yes.
Is that closed now,
that's
essentially?
Been closed for, since 1995, September 20th, 1995, actually.
So they don't use it for anything except helicopters anymore.
And not even that. They've torn a lot of those down now. They're using it, well, the Marines have got part of it over closer to Admiral's Row, that side. The Marines are on that side. And then they've got some E2s over on that side, some CODs, that kind of thing. They don't really have much going on. They've changed up all of that over there now. And I think they remediate all those buildings because of the asbestos and everything they had in them that everybody worked in for, I don't know how many decades, you know, basically 1922 to 1995 in the depot. But, I mean, they tore a lot of that down. They got some of it, but it's mostly been changed over to other aircraft type.
Well, you see a lot of these CODs going in practicing landings at Patrick Henry.
Oh, on the other side of there, yeah, the training, that used to be the, when I was, one of the things that's not in my bio that Bob didn't have is that I was a naval officer, but I was intelligence, and then I went on to do the other type of intelligence, not the military kind. And then I ended up being a senior intelligence advisor for the Joint Forces Command, and I was doing commentating for the networks until 2003 when we went back into Iraq again, and then I had done the book on No One Left Behind about the Scott Spiker story, and so, but it's, my skill sets are very unique, and they wanted those skill sets back and made me an offer, and I said, okay, and I didn't have to do it forever, I just needed to do it for, not a very long period of time, so I did, and I ended up with, running a couple of teams that my expertise area, had 15 people working for me, and they would do whatever I asked. But in that time frame, working in that environment again, you realize how important even just the roll-up of everything that I've learned over the years, not only writing but the research part is so important, and knowing things like I did about the aircraft types and abilities here and there and doing whatever, it all mattered. I mean, I'd already done at least one book on Oceania at that point in time, and it talked to everybody, and I had contacts all over the place, and that helped too. I mean, I think I can understand, the draw getting me back, but it was taxing trying to ride around that while I was doing it, because you have to get a clearance again, and then that whole thing starts a do loop you don't really want to be in anymore. I realized I didn't like it that much. I'd rather write, and I'd rather be free to write what I wanted to write, So that was always a tough thing.
Anybody else with a question?
There was a question about, you had a question beforehand about. You can ask now.
Well, I'm just curious how you pivoted from whatever you were doing to aviation. What made aviation, important to you?
I always had a fascination with anything with the flu, but I grew up in a family of aviators, and my great uncle was a highly decorated World War II combat pilot. He helped sink the last carrier battleship the Japanese had at the end of the war, and I was always his favorite because he had a couple of kids, but they weren't his favorites. he had me, and he loved me, and and he was one of those guys who flew World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and he was the first operational department head for what became the E-2 squadrons today, that we know as the Woolly Fuds way back when, and I just remember how everything about him just fascinated me, And then my dad was a pilot, my brother is a pilot. And I flew in all my dad's planes. We were talking about some of the crazy things that happened there. My father did things like, we teased him years later. We didn't have the sense of humor back then when he did it initially, but he bought 8 Spitfire trainers in the 70s, about 1973 or so, as I recall. He kept one, but he sold the other ones off the pier, and they came into Norfolk in crates. And they looked just like the Spitfire. They're all painted up the same, the same British markings and everything. And he kept that with the planes, the plane he had. But he used to do aerobatics with us in the plane, which my mother really hated. That's why the plane did not last that long with him, because she made him get rid of it. She didn't appreciate that. But my brother and I got to do aerobatics in the plane with him, and then that plane was sold to Art Scholl, actually, the aerobatic pilot, and it went on its way. But my father did keep an airplane, just a regular Cessna 172 that we fly around in after that. But it was an interesting thing, though. I was always around airplanes. I just spent my time around airplanes and pilots, and loved it. And the military was on the air side for intelligence, and so I was always in the airplanes. And that's how I hurt my back, actually. I was rappelling out of a helicopter in the Patrick Henry practice area. We were over there. We had been over doing some things. I was doing extraction training, and I had the full pack on. Navy SEAL came down over my back, and I got bruised from here to there, you know, and it killed my back, my lower back, because I had an 80-pound pack on, and I was all about maybe 110 pounds wet, soaking wet, you know, and he was a big dude. And it turns out that a friend of mine who ended up going in NIS after that same kind of experience ended up getting hurt the same way, same type of circumstance. But the object of the whole thing was to rappel, you know, X number of feet down, do the jump, do the things, get back up, go all over again until you get it right. You had speed thing. So yeah, that worked out great in the end. Not, but I've always loved airplanes. My husband's a naval aviator also.
Did you ever get a license?
No, I never did, you know, but the helo pilots out at the air station will let me sit in the seat, and they teach me how to do, you know, we did auto rotations, we did all kinds of things. They were teaching me all the things they could to do it. And I have my flight log book too, because they logged everything I did. I ended up, at the end of the day, got out of the Navy on that side as a lieutenant. And my husband continued on, obviously, until he retired. But he was E-2C Hawkeyes, which is an interesting aircraft, very interesting aircraft. Any other questions?
Any other questions?
All right, we're getting quiet in here. That's Well, thank you for having me. And if you have any other questions you want to ask afterwards, that's fine too. And I have the ability to sign books for you if you need that too.
A couple of things. First of all, we'd like to thank everybody for coming, and of course we thank Amy for an excellent and very entertaining presentation. Got a couple of quick announcements before we wrap it up. First of all, as Amy said, she'll be glad to sign any books that you do have. The York County Historical Committee prints and sells these books, which are just chock full of great information about the history of York County. They're available in the bookstore downstairs. The most recent one that we have out is the African American history during the colonial period. These are both $20, and they're at the gallery downstairs. We'd like to invite you to visit the York County Historical Museum, which is in the basement of this building. It's closed right now, but it's going to have its summer hours opening up pretty quickly. And if you go down there, you'll have an opportunity to see one of Yorktown's real hidden gems in the Historical Museum. And finally, I'd like to invite you to our next and last lecture of the spring, which is scheduled for May the 1st, and is titled Lost Attractions of Hampton Roads. And we'll be putting out more information about that shortly. But again, Amy, thank you very much. We appreciate it.
Thanks
And
for being
thank you
here.
for coming.